Welcome back to the AHF. I'm going to talk today about target zones. And by that we mean what we actually aim for when we're actually doing our sparring, what we're trying to achieve, what we want to avoid, and what possibly is not actually going to be on target, if you like. And that means we wouldn't target or we wouldn't score. Now, we're obviously doing a martial arts with this, and not a sport, even though there are sportive elements, and it may sometimes be called a combat sport or something like that. But we're always taking it back to the original sources of you're learning these weapons to survive, self-defense or sometimes military scenarios. So you're learning to use the weapon in a way which is going to be martially effective and protect and defend your own life. And those points are really, really important to remember all the time when you're doing HEMA, no matter what you're doing. Obviously in some tournament scenarios, if people go into tournaments, you might think a little bit differently because you're going to score a point. But in your basic HEMA training, you should always be taking it back to, is what I'm doing safe to actually use yourself, and will it do something to our opponent which is worth doing? Now, as far as target zones go, the human body for our sparring is all a target zone, whether it's thrust or cut, and historically that's the way it was. There is a valid argument for doing everything from sniping the hands to stabbing the foot. So all target zones are used, except in certain combinations of weapons. And what I'd say about that is, if you're using something like a saber, a backsword, a longsword, a basic arming sword, thrust and cut all over the body is absolutely fine. Absolutely no problem. When you get to a rapier, if you look at the rapier texts, I'm not aware of any rapier text that shows cutting to the torso. And I have seen also reference to recommending not cutting to the shoulder as well, because it's just too strong. So when we're doing rapier, we do not score any cuts to the torso and the shoulders. That still means you've got the head, the neck, the arms and the legs. So you've still got most of the body to cut against. But and also thrust, all target zones of course, no problem with the thrust. So that's the rapier. So the rapier still can cut, but it has to be delivered with some power. Again, it's not always easy to make as good a cut with a rapier as, say, it is with a longsword, but it has a valid use with rapier as long as you choose your targets well. Now, why would that be the case? Well, just look at a rapier. It's not as light or flimsy as a lot of people think, but it does not have the cutting power, of course, of things like a saber or a longsword. So you are aiming specifically to lighter protected areas and more vulnerable areas. You'd be surprised how resilient the torso can be to some cutting actions. Now, if you've got a saber, for example, and you hack into the flank, that's legitimately good technique, providing you do it in a safe manner for yourself and don't get hit afterwards, which is another point to discuss in a minute. But as a target zone, we wouldn't do it. And you will see it done in, say, tournaments where people will use very much saber cutting techniques with a rapier, because what you're basically doing is giving yourself a massive reach advantage over what a saber would have, but using saber technique. So you've got a 42 or a 45-inch rapier able to cut into the flank, where a saber would only be 32 to 34 inch. So those techniques in a sportive scenario are quite effective. Tapping the flank with a rapier with a cut, yeah, it's quite effective to score a point, but whereas a real fight, it's going to have little to no effect at all. You might break the skin and you might cause a little bit of pain, but it's going to be quite modest, as well as the fact of if they're wearing any kind of clothing. Now, clothing would have been varied quite a lot. If you look at what people wore when they fought with rapiers, they might be wearing something like a doublet, which could be wool and multiple layers, as well as other sort of outer garments. But they might also be stripped down to the shirts, which did happen with dueling as well. So it could vary, but even if you're talking about, fighting in an actual shirt, how much damage would the rapier do on a cut? Again, what are we calling a rapier? Well, it's the kind of golden era of those really long bladed kind of 42-ish or 45-inch blade rapiers. So they really are point orientated with some cutting actions. Still a fair few cutting actions, but they've not got the cutting power to strike sort of the target zones of the torso. So we avoid cuts to those target areas. And then if you went on to something like the small sword, which is the next development on from the rapier. Now, a small sword is, if you look at the video I did on small swords, essentially a downsized rapier, but it's got so light that most of them just got rid of the edges completely. You will find some small swords with edges, but as a general rule, they're not at all intended for the cut. They are thrust only. And then, again, you would limit the target zones in relation to the weapons. So you would take out any cutting action whatsoever and just go to the actual point work, at which point, again, all target zones would be on for the point. The last thing to bear in mind with your how basically sort of how things are scored, if you like, it's not a sportive system, and when we're doing our free sparring, there's an expectation that fighters will accept the hits themselves, they'll record hits themselves. It's not a sort of a points-based tournament style setting all the time, and you have to therefore consider how good would your attack be. If you reach forward and snipe somebody's leg and they cave your head in afterwards, for example, that's absolutely useless. A good leg cut can kill a fighter, no doubt about it, but if you've lost your head trying to do it, no good at all. So in terms of your target zones, we've got those on and off target zones, of which most of the weapons we use, it's all target zones all of the time, but you still have to consider, is what you're doing going to actually be effective? Because you have to get proper edge alignment, you have to get enough power into the blow, and you have to get enough actual, basically slight action with some cuts as well, and enough power in your thrusts. So they have to be good strikes. They have to be on target zones which are effective with the weapon you're using, and they have to be delivered in ways which are going to stop you getting hurt yourself. And that's really quite important. There are some actions that we would do in HEMA which would leave you vulnerable to a response, but they are techniques that are intended to deliver a fight-ending move, whether that is death or incapacitation for your opponent. So there are times you'll see you reach in and you cut straight to the head, for example, full power with a longsword or a saber, and there's a possibility on some of those actions that you might not recover in time and you might be struck afterwards. But the intention is that it's immediately fight ending. The same if you deliver a hard cut to the lead arm. So there are some actions like that where we would say, if we were having a sort of a sportive type tournament fight, which we sometimes will in the club, and we want to try and score things, well, what we'll say is a double hit, it's basically going to have to be discounted, or we sometimes use punishments such as press-ups to discourage it, but we'd also weight it to a certain degree, where if somebody's delivered a light strike that wouldn't be debilitating or incapacitating, and the other has, we might score it in their favour if it's obvious. So if something brushes the flank, taps the edge of the arm or something, and the other person caves the head in, we will score that. After all, there are so many accounts historically of double hits happening that they are, as much as you want to rule them out, they are a fact of swordsmanship and, well, fighting generally. So there you go, there's a bit about target zones, how it works with different weapons, and sort of how we use it in the club. Thanks for watching.